Welcome back to Country Cow Designs. I'm Jo, and in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to sew your own Daythum sling bag. So we're really excited about this new pattern. So this is the Daythum sling bag. I know that sling bags are really popular and we've been wanting to make one for a while, but we haven't seen any like this kind of style. And obviously now that Adam's working with me, he wanted it to be suitable for guys as well as girls. So that's kind of why we went for this style in the end. We've sized it so it's like a really handy size and you can fit, you know, your everyday stuff in it. So to start with, you've got your slip pocket on the front, and on the back you've got a big zip pocket for your phone. And because it's on your back when you're wearing it, it's quite secure. So that's the reason for that pocket. Now on the inside you have a little slip pocket, and this is sized so that you can take it walking with you, and we can fit a sports bottle drink in there nice and easy, and you've got loads of room for a wallet, your keys, your sunglasses, maybe your sun cream, that sort of thing. So the idea is, if you want to keep your hands free and you want to go for a walk or something like that, this is a great bag for it. So I'll just show you what it looks like on. So you can choose whether you want it going over your right shoulder or your left. And in the pattern and in the video, I'm making it going over my right shoulder. If you want to change it to your left, just pay attention to the pattern when you're fitting the bottom of the strap and you can change it over. Alternatively, some of the testers used hooks and D-rings so that they can swap it from side to side, which is a great idea. We did it this way because we're trying to make this a really minimal hardware pattern. So the only hardware that you need to buy is a rectangle ring, a strap slider, and some rivets if you want to use them, but they're optional. So the testers for this pattern made a few different changes. Check out the website listing and you will see some photos where they've made the grab handle bigger, or they've used the D-rings and hooks instead. Different things like that. Some of them also use some different stabilizers, so you can check that out. So to actually sew along with this video, you'll need to buy the sewing pattern. It's available from countrycowdesigns.com. The sewing pattern itself has step-by-step photo instructions for the whole thing. It has a really handy cutting chart for cutting out all of your pattern pieces, and it has printable pattern pieces for every single piece. The video is really just a complement to go along with it for those who prefer to learn visually, and also for those of you who just want to see what's involved before you buy the pattern, because you don't necessarily want to commit until you know whether it's something you're capable of doing. Personally, I think this is a pretty simple bag to make and it's pretty fast. I have labelled it as intermediate because of the curves. These curves, they're not always easy. And when you're starting out, really just practice makes perfect. You just need to keep trying with curves, which is why we didn't list it as a beginner pattern. So for everything that I use in this video, all the tools, all the fabrics, everything like that, there will be links in the video description. So if you just click on the little arrow by the video name, it should drop down the description. It will give you all the links that you need. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I love to hear what you guys think. Let me know whether you like the bag, what you'd like to see us do next, anything like that. It's just always great to hear from you guys. And as always, there are chapters in the video. So if you're looking for a specific part of the pattern, you can go drag your mouse along the timeline and it will tell you the chapter that you're on. So you can skip to a specific chapter. So if you're just looking for some advice on the gusset, you can just skip straight to where you need to go. So use those, that'll make it really quick if you are sewing along with the pattern. So I really hope you guys enjoy this pattern and that you like this bag as much as we do. I'm just going to quickly show you one of the guys' ones that we've done. So Adam made a denim one on his industrial sewing machine. So there's no way my domestic machine could make it through denim, not with the layers involved. So all of my bags I made on my Benina 930 record domestic sewing machine, but Adam's made one for you on his industrial, just to check that the pattern works on industrial machines as well. And he's going to come around and show us what that looks like.
Right, okay.
So I just want to show you guys that it is quite a unisex pattern. So this is one that Adam made with an old pair of jeans, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And he went for like the mustard zips and webbing for a nice little contrast.
That was a total gamble.
Yeah, total gamble, but it looks good.
It paid off, right, actually, didn't it?
Yeah, and
I wasn't a fan of sling bags, was I?
No, Adam has always had a bit of a hatred for sling bags. I'm not really sure why. But we finally won him over with this one. So yeah, you like it now, don't you? You're going to make one for your camera equipment.
I think I'm going to do one out of a soft veg tan leather, probably with some padding in it, and make it into sort of small mobile camera bag. Hopefully, that's the plan.
So again, that's going to be on his industrial, because my domestic machine would never make it through a leather one of these.
Nah, no way.
No, not a chance. Poor little Benina would struggle. So I really hope you guys enjoy the tutorial, and let's hope this bag comes out lovely at the end. Okay, so these are the fabrics that I'm using for my bag. So I've got my exterior back zip. So that's for the back pocket. This is my main gusset zip. I've already put the pulls onto each of those. Then for the hardware, I've just got my 1.5 inch rectangle ring and my 1.5 inch strap slider. And then I'm going to use 4 rivets as well. For my webbing, I've got for the main part of the strap, 1.5 inch nylon webbing. And I've also got a small bit of webbing for the bottom that's going to hold the rectangle ring. Then for on top of this, I have my cotton webbing, which is 1 inch wide. And I also have my 1 inch cotton grab handle. And I've got my double fold bias binding. So this we'll be using right at the very end. And by double fold, that means that these edges are folded in and then it's folded again. And that should be 1/2 inch wide once it's folded. So mine actually is only 3/8 of an inch wide, which is annoying because it said it was 1/2 inch when I bought it, but it's not. So this is going to be a little bit tough to use, but I don't have any other stuff on hand right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that. As an alternative, you could use waterproof canvas, which you can just cut at 1 inch wide, and then you can just kind of wrap it around the seams. Or you can use fold over elastic as well. So for my stabilizers, I'm using Peltex for the base, so that's nice and thick. You could use Decaville heavy if you prefer. Then for the top gussets and the strap tab and the main panels, I'm using Decaville light. Again, if you prefer, you could use foam, you could use fleece. It would just give the bag slightly different structure depending what you use, but all of those would work just fine. I'm also going to use a little bit of Decaville heavy behind the rivets on the front of the bag. You could use any stabilizer that you have offcuts of. This is just really good for making sure that your rivets stay in place in the long term. For the lining, I've got this Alison glass fabric and everything is interfaced with woven interfacing. So that's my zip pocket facing and my 2 zip pocket pieces. This is my front slip pocket for the lining side of it. These are my 2 main panels, my 2 slip pocket pieces, my 2 top gusset pieces, and my base gusset piece. For the exterior, for the pocket, I'm using this black Alison glass fabric. For the strap tab, I'm using the same fabric. I've got my slip pocket overlay, so that's an optional extra, but if you're using the slip pocket overlay, make sure you're using cork or vinyl or leather because it needs to have raw edges that are okay to be left that way. Then I've got my 2 exterior top gusset pieces, my base gusset piece, and my 2 main panels. Now I am trying out for the first time a new interfacing, so you can see that the pattern is a lot clearer through this because this interfacing is thinner. So this is Vilene G700, which is what I normally use. It's very similar to SF101 that's available in America. This, however, is called Woven Fix 2, not to be confused with Woven Fuse 2. This is completely different. Woven Fix 2 is from Serial Bag Makers in Europe, and I'm just giving this a go as I'm deciding whether to start stocking this. We'd really like to start stocking things like Decaville light and interfacing. We're just making the decision now, but thought this would be a great bag to try it out on. So having one of them interface with that and one interface with the standard, hopefully when the bag's complete, I can really see what the difference is between the two. So step 1 is straps and preparation. Now, before you do anything else, you just want to fuse your stabilizers to the lining pieces. So you've got your base stabilizer to your base lining piece, and your 2 top stabilizers and your 2 main panels. And you can see that everything is centered. So my Decaville light is centered within the seams. Now you could fuse these to the exterior instead, but I definitely don't recommend it on the back exterior panel because it will make fitting your zip pocket much harder. So just bear that in mind if you do decide to fuse to your exterior pieces instead. Now you're going to need your nylon webbing and your cotton webbing and your short nylon webbing piece. You're also going to need your strap hardware, your 2 strap tab pieces and the Decaville light. Now you don't want to fuse this one yet because we're going to fit it after we've attached these together. So the first thing we're going to do for this step, we are going to attach the cotton webbing to the nylon webbing. So what you want to do is make sure that they match up at the end, and you're going to center it the whole way down. So I'm going to fix mine in place using some fabric glue. Alternatively, you could use double-sided tape. I tend to find that it doesn't stick very well to the cotton webbing, but that does depend what tape you're using. Now I'm going to top stitch this in place with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge of the cotton. I'm going to do that down both long sides so that it's fixed in place down the entire length. So as usual, I'm using my Bernina 930 record sewing machine, which was given to me by my grandmother, and she bought it new quite a few years ago. So it's a good domestic sewing machine, but you'll notice that all of my patterns are designed for a domestic sewing machine. Okay, so once that's fixed in place, you're ready to sew it. Just make sure that your tension is correct when you're sewing this, because if your tension's really high, it can cause the nylon webbing to go kind of wavy. And also you want to make sure that you've got a stitch colour that's going to look good on both sides. If you don't have 1-inch cotton webbing, don't let that put you off. You could cut some fabric 2 inches wide. So just imagine that this is 2 inches wide. And then you could just fold both edges into the centre, which would give you a 1-inch wide piece of fabric that you can run down the centre of this strap. Alternatively, you can of course just use the 1.5-inch webbing. Just be aware that depending on the strap slider you're using and the thickness of the webbing, it might kind of slide too easily. So you might just need to build it up underneath the fold when you attach this later on. So one of these raw edges is going to be hidden within the strap tab, but the other one we need to sort of hide the end. So one option, if you're using black webbing for both of these, you could zigzag stitch the end and that would look quite neat. Or you can always just leave it raw and it's going to be kind of hidden underneath the strap. So it's totally up to you. But another option is to cut a little piece as recommended in the pattern. So I'm using cork. You could use vinyl, leather, anything that doesn't mind having a raw edge. If you're using cork, you can get kind of fluffy edges. So you just treat that with a lighter and that will stop those edges from fluffying up over time. Okay, so now we're going to just wrap that around the end. I'm going to use a little bit of glue to hold that in place, and I'm going to top stitch this with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance across here so that I catch both sides. So next we're going to have the short nylon piece of webbing and the rectangle ring. And we're just going to fold that around so that the ends meet and clip it together. Now the reason this doesn't have any cotton webbing on it is because this is going into the main seam of the bag and you do not want any more layers than you need to have. So I'm going to stitch this with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to go up here and then as close as I can get to this rectangle ring and back down. To get close to the rectangle ring, I'm going to use a hump jumper under my presser foot so that it lifts the presser foot up and keeps it level with this ring. Okay, so that's how it's going to look once it's done. Now this is a hump jumper, so you can see it's got a thicker side and a thinner side, and usually you'll find one of those sides will match up with the hardware that you're using. So now we're going to finish this strap. So grab your strap slider. And what we want to do is just wrap this around the center bar. So just going to fold it back on itself. Now this is where, if you're just using nylon webbing, you will probably want to like fold it around an extra time, which is a little bit awkward. But if you don't, it's not going to be thick enough and it's going to kind of slide through the strap slider really easily. So just be aware of that. It does depend on the webbing you're using, but that's generally the problem that I found. So I'm just going to clip that in place. And I'm going to fit a couple of rivets to secure this in place. Now, because of the thickness here, you might want to use long rivets. Really depends on the thickness of the webbings that you're using. If you've got one of these rivet placement templates is really handy for this sort of thing. So you just line it up on the strap and mark it. So I'm just going to mark 2 rivets. Okay, and then I'm going to use my rivet hole punch to punch these holes. Okay, once you've got your holes cut, you can just pop your rivets through. Now, if you prefer, you could do 2 over here. Just make sure that you don't rivet through your stitching. And now I'm going to take these over to my press and set them. Okay, so once those are set, grab the open end of your strap and you need to put your rectangle ring onto it. Then make sure that your strap doesn't have any twists or kinks, and it's going to go back through this slider. So you're just going up and over. So when you pull that tight, you will end up with your rectangle ring and your strap connector. And you can see that that raw edge that we covered, it is sandwiched in between here. So it's going to be pretty well hidden. But we wanted to give you an option for, you know, covering that raw edge anyway. So now we're going to fit the strap tab. So grab your 2 strap tab pieces and the stabilizer. And what we're going to do is have this nylon webbing facing up, so the thicker webbing. Place your strap tab right side up. And you want to have it lying completely across it. You want about 1.5 inches space up here. Make sure it's centered. And then just clip it in place. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and just baste this strap on at the top with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that's basted, we are going to place the other strap tab right sides together. And I'm just going to clip this on all the edges. Now we're going to sew these 3 edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're not sewing the straight bottom edge. So make sure you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this. For most of the pattern it's 3/8, but for this step it is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so that is now sewn, and what we're going to do is just kind of trim these top corners down. It will make it slightly easier to get a neat finish later. And it just removes the bulk. If you wanted to, you could snip into these with some pinking shears or something, but I'm not going to worry about that. I found they come out quite nicely as it is. So we're just turning this right sides out. And you're going to want to get something like a turning tool or a chopstick or whatever you've got lying about that you can use to poke these top corners out. I'm really starting to notice the difference with this Woven Fix 2 interfacing. It is a lot thicker, which is great for this sort of thing because this strap tab is going to need to be strong, so it's nice. Right, once you're done with that, you want to slip your Decaville light in. So I'm going to have mine so that it's on this side of the strap. It's not really too important which side it is, but I think that'll be slightly nicer because it's going to lay on your back like that, or on your shoulder, I suppose. Once you've got your Decaville all the way in there, make sure it's nice and tight. You can press this whole thing with an iron if you want, but I'm not going to. I'm going to skip straight to the top stitching. I'm going to top stitch all 4 edges with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that's sewn in place, I want to sew an extra box where the webbing is to really give it some extra strength, and so that it's not just pulling on this seam here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the edge of the webbing. So we're looking for the edge of the nylon webbing, and I'm going to use an erasable fabric pen to mark it. Always check your erasable fabric pens that they erase on the fabric that you're using. And I'm marking it on all 3 edges. Okay, so now I can see where the edges are. I'm going to sew it with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along here. So I'm just starting from the top stitching, coming down here and across, and I'm going to back stitch well. Make sure you're sewing an 1/8 of an inch away from the line and not on the line, because that is the edge of your strap. So there it is sewn. A few of the testers chose to add rivets instead. You can definitely do that, but just bear in mind that this is going to be sat on your shoulder, so it's just whether you want to have the rivets on your shoulder or not. So I'm going to take this over to the iron and remove these lines, and then I'm going to move on to the next step. Step 2 is your front panel. You're going to need one of your main exterior panels, your slip pocket lining, and your exterior slip pocket. Now, when you're cutting this out, don't panic that the slip pocket is wider. It is supposed to be a little bit wider, and I'll explain that later. So first of all, place your 2 slip pocket pieces right sides together. Make sure everything matches up nicely and clip together. We're going to sew from here along this little straight edge, along this bit, around the curve and back down to here. And we're going to use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So sewing this curve can be a little bit tricky. If you struggle with curves, I would really recommend drawing it on before you begin. Just drawing on that seam allowance and following the line is a lot easier. Also, reduce your stitch length. A shorter stitch length makes it much easier to sew curves. Okay, so once that's sewn, we are going to just trim off these top little pointy bits just to try and remove the bulk. So don't cut through your stitching, just, cutting around it. And then for the curve, you can snip into it, but the simplest way I find is to use some pinking shears. This kind of does it for you. Because what you want to do is snip in little triangles, which will allow the curve to sit better. Okay, so now you can go ahead and turn that out. And you want to be careful with these corners. We're going to spend a bit of time pushing it out. This again is where a turning tool or a chopstick or something that's pointy but not too pointy is really going to help you out. And I'm also going to kind of try and open this seam a little bit. This thicker interfacing is making it slightly harder. Okay, so you kind of want to push the seam out so that you get a nice neat edge. So I'm going to spend a while just pushing these out, then I'm going to press it with the iron to make sure that I've got a really nice neat finish. Okay, so that's pressed. You can see I've got a nice neat edge. Both of these points are kind of matching. So if you want to fit a handmade or a business logo, you could fit one just here on this exterior part of the pocket. This would be the best time to do that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch all of this top edge, and then I'm going to baste this bit closed. When we're top stitching, we use a longer stitch length. I tend to use a 4 because that's the longest that my machine will do. This will mean that sewing this top curve will be slightly more difficult than before because you're using a longer stitch length. So just take your time with it. Right, once your pocket is done, we need to fit it to the main panel. Now the bottom of the pocket and the panel should match up perfectly, so you want to clip those together first. So you can do this by matching the centres, but I'm just going to do mine by look now. Once your bottom is clipped together, your pocket should be very slightly wider. I mean, we're talking like an 1/8 of an inch at the top. It's not hardly anything, but what you need to do to make sure that it fits is to bring it in to match at the top so that they're even, and then clip it up the side. And then you do the same thing on this side. You just want to bring it in so that they're lined up and then clip together. And this will cause you to have a tiny bit of like a puffiness coming out of the pocket. That is what we want, because when this bag is assembled, if you don't have a very slightly larger pocket, then the back panel will crease slightly where the pocket is. So we're just making sure that that doesn't happen. Once this is assembled, you will not be able to tell that the pocket is bigger. So now I'm going to baste this onto the main panel, but I'm going to start at the center on the bottom, and then I'm going to sew up this side. Then I'm going to go back to the center on the bottom and sew up the other side. This is going to feel a little bit strange on your machine. The reason that we're doing it this way is because when you're sewing almost all fabrics, they're going to stretch a tiny bit. If you start at the top on one side and work your way down and around and up to the other side, your pocket will end up a tiny bit wonky because it's stretched going both ways. So by doing it this way, we're just going to make sure that the pocket is going to be completely straight. Okay, so once that's done, I need to fit the rivets at the top. Now, if you're not having rivets, you can literally just sew up to these points, come across and back down. You can do it with a 1/16 of an inch up here and come back with like a scant 1/4 of an inch, and that will mean that you're not sewing over the existing top stitching, but that will hold the pocket in place on the sides. Alternatively, if you want to fit rivets, then you want to make sure that this is sitting flat, and you want to mark them so that they're level and equal. So I've already done that, and now I'm just going to use my Japanese hole punch to punch the hole. I'm also going to punch a hole through my Decaville Heavy scrap. Now, if like me, you're using rainbow rivets, I saw a great tip on a Facebook group recently. Rather than using your rainbow rivets where they're not going to be seen, use a rainbow post on one side with a brass or a silver or whatever cap on the hidden side. So I'm going to put that through there, then through the Decaville, and then pop your cheaper rivet on the inside. That way you're just saving a bit of money, because the rainbow rivets, they're really expensive. So make sure this is lying flat again. We're going to make sure that all of the puffiness that we've got, not sure if that's even a word, like, you know, how it's puffing out of the bag, is in the center. And then on this side, I'm going to use the rainbow cap, and I'm going to put the brass post through from the other side. And that way I've only used one rivet. So I'll take those over to my press and set these rivets, and then we'll move on to step 3. Let's start step 3, which is the back panel. For this step, you're going to need your zip pocket facing, your 2 zip pocket pieces, which are the bigger ones. They're bigger than your slip pocket pieces. Then we've got a zip for the back pocket and an exterior main panel. So the first thing we need to do is mark your zip pocket facing on the wrong side of the fabric. So this is the interfacing side. I've marked it 1 inch in from each edge to create a box, and then I've marked this center line with triangles at the end. Now I'm going to put that right sides together with this back panel, and you need to make sure that it's 1/2 inch in from this edge and 1 inch in from the bottom edge. You can use a bit of double-sided tape on the other side of this. Just make sure it's perfectly centered so it will be within the box. Alternatively, you could pin it in place, because we're going to cut through that box anyway, so it doesn't matter if you're using pins, even if it's on cork or vinyl. So once that's safely stuck in place, we're just going to sew this outside box. Now make sure that you don't start on a corner, because it's very hard then to get a neat finish on the corner. So you just want to start in from one corner. As you reach each corner, reduce your stitch length I go down to about a 1.5 with cork. I wouldn't go any shorter than that. And it's just on the corners. This will help you to get a much neater edge on your corners. Now we need to cut this center line and the triangles. And we need to get as close as possible to the corners without cutting the stitching. So the way I prefer to do this is with a craft knife. You can use a pair of scissors instead. I just find that with a craft knife I can get really close to those stitches without cutting them. But it's probably worth checking if you've got a new blade before you do that, because that makes a big difference. So you're cutting through both layers. So now we need to push this through to the other side. And this is why we don't recommend using the stabilizer on your exterior panel, because this will be much harder if you have. Okay, so what we're going to do to get a neat finish is just kind of press this along your stitch lines. Now, if you're using all cotton, you could just use the iron on this, but I prefer not to use my iron on cork. I know a lot of people do, but I've had some corks that it's not reacted well to heat, so I don't like to risk it. So there you go, you're just going to push it through to the other side, and we need to get these edges nice and neat. That is going to be a lot harder if you have Decaville in them. Okay, so if you've got cotton for all of your exterior, this is going to be nice and easy, but because I've got cork, it's kind of fighting me. So I've got my double-sided tape. I'm going to stick it down on all 4 sides. Okay, so as you do this, just kind of roll that seam. Make sure you've got a really nice, crisp finish on that seam. Okay, and your corners should be looking kind of neat. If you have massive creases on your corners, it's normally because you've not cut close enough to your stitches, or if you've used a longer stitch length, it can kind of end up with a slightly messier finish. But this is how it should look from the exterior. Now set that aside for a moment and grab your pocket pieces and your zip. If you have a directional print on your fabric, it should be facing upwards like this, so this should be the height. Make sure that you pay attention to the pattern instructions for the next couple of steps, because that will determine whether your pocket comes out with the fabric the right way up. Okay, so place one of your pocket pieces right side up. Place the zip right side up also. Make sure that the zip is closing upwards and that your pattern print is upwards as well. So my pattern print, it's not directional, it doesn't matter. But if you do have a directional print, say it's a person, you'd want their head here and their body here. So just clip those together with them both right side up. And then we're going to sew this long edge here with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So a scant just means slightly less than. So to stop my zips from fraying, I actually just use a little flame on them. Exactly the same as I do with the cork to stop that. Just for a moment, it just seems to stop the nylon from fraying. Now, grab your other pocket piece, have it right side up again. Now this time the zip is closing down, and if you have a directional print, it should be facing down. So it will be going in the same direction as the zip. Okay, so just line up on that edge. Make sure that your pockets line up on these edges too, and just clip that in place. And again, we're going to sew this with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So to make this pocket easier to fit, we want this to kind of lay flat, so you can see it's kind of folding up a little bit at the moment. So this is how you want your pocket to be, the wrong side of the fabric with the right side of the zip. But we want this to lay flat, it will make the next step easier. Now I'm just going to press mine with an iron, and that's going to flatten that out. If you're using something like waterproof canvas, what you can do is you can just top stitch that down, and that will then assure on both sides that it sits completely flat. It'll make it easier to fit. Okay, so now that's lying flatter. Make sure that your zip is going to close upwards, because that's how we want it to be on the bag. You don't really want it closing downwards because it will kind of end up hanging off the edge of the bag. And then what we want to do is place some fabric glue or double-sided tape just along these edges of the zip. It will help hold it in place while we're sewing. Okay, and then we're going to place this on top. Now your pocket facing should kind of line up with the edges of the pocket. And you can just stick down one side at a time. Just make sure it's straight. And that glue should just hold it in place while we stitch it. So we're going to sew around the outside with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that your pocket is open, so completely open like this when you're sewing it. If you've got both pocket pieces to one side, you're going to sew the pocket closed and you're not going to be able to use it. So for this step, I really recommend a matching thread. So I'm using like a natural coloured thread that kind of blends into the cork quite well. Especially when you're sewing cork and vinyl, you want to get this right first time, because if you redo it, then you can see your stitch holes. So having a matching thread, it just means that, you know, if it's slightly wonky, if it's not quite perfect, nobody's ever going to see it. Okay, so now that is sewn, what you're going to do is just turn that over. And you want both of your pocket pieces to be pointing into the center like this. So just make sure that they're lying nice and flat, and then clip the sides. Okay, now we need to trim this end bit off. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to sew the pocket closed. So you're going to stitch down the side, across the bottom, and up this side. Now what we're going to do is sew it like this on the machine. That way we make sure we're not going to sew through the main panel. Okay, so once that's all sewn up, the last thing you're going to do is just trim this bottom edge of the pocket. So that's the bottom edge of your main panel. And you just want to trim it down. Don't make it too short, just, you know, 1/8 of an inch or something is fine. The reason we're doing this, the bottom edge is the hardest to sew later because it's got the thick stabilizer in it. So we're just going to make it that little bit smaller, and it will just make it very slightly easier later on. So you can now set that panel aside and we will move on to the next step. Step 4 is the gusset. For this step, you're going to need your 2 exterior top gusset pieces and your base exterior piece. Then for the lining, you're going to need your 2 top gusset pieces and your base gusset piece. And of course, you're going to need your gusset zip. So if you want to have 2 zip pulls that close towards each other, you can absolutely do that. But I wanted to keep this as minimal as possible on hardware, which is why it's only got 1 zip. Now, if you've not used by the yard or by the meter nylon zip tape before, it's quite simple to put the zip pull on. So I'll just show you how to do that. You just need to open up the teeth on one end, and then you put the rounded edge of the zip on. So you just want to put it on a tiny bit on one side and then bring the other side up to meet it. And then you just give it a little push. And if you put it on a flat surface, then you can hold on to the zip tape on both sides and just pull the zip. And then if you want to have one coming the other direction so that they meet in the middle, then you just simply put one on from the other end. Now you can add your zip pull now, or you can do it after we've assembled the gusset if you're confident about putting it on. So I'll leave that for you to decide. So if you haven't already, you need to fuse your stabilizers to your lining pieces. And you can also mark the centers on everything. It will make it a little bit easier to line it up. So that's optional. I'm actually not going to do that. So I'm going to take one of my exterior top gusset pieces and I'm going to place the zip right sides together. I'm going to place that centered and just clip together. Now, if you have a huge zip pull like mine, I would recommend fitting it after we do this, but I'm going to show you how to do it if you're fitting the zip now, because a lot of people worry about getting it on straight at the end. So what we're going to do first of all is just baste this edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that's sewn in, what you need to do is grab one of your lining top gusset pieces. This is going to be the same size as your exterior pieces, and you just want to place that on top. So it's right sides together with the exterior, and then the zip is sandwiched in the middle. And just match it up on the edges, or if you've got center marks, you can match it up using those and clip together. Now we're going to sew through this. I'm going to use a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's because my standard presser foot fits perfectly here, and then I can move my needle over, and I use my presser foot to butt up against the zip teeth and get a really straight finish. If you want to use a standard zipper foot, that's fine, and if you want to use a bigger seam allowance, that's also fine, because we will trim the base to match at the end. Okay, so once you've got that sewn, you just want to push this away from the zip. So you can see I got a nice straight edge by using my zip as a guide. You could draw the seam allowance on as an alternative option. Okay, so just press this. If you're using all cotton, just go ahead and press it with an iron. It'll get you a really nice finish. Again, I don't really like to use my iron on cork, so I try to avoid it if I can. Okay, and then I'm going to clip the exterior and the lining together. This zip pull is just trying to encourage me. You can do it. Which is always helpful when I'm making bags. Okay, so everything should be laying nice and flat. Different fabrics kind of fold back differently. With cork, it's kind of thick, so you lose a tiny bit here as well, which is why in a minute we're going to trim the base down to match. So anything like this, just, you know, it's worked out, and we make sure that the base matches it. So next we're going to top stitch this long edge, then we're going to baste these 3 edges closed. If you're wondering why I'm kind of lifting the clips up, it's because my machine has a very badly placed thread cutter which catches on my clips, and then it messes up my stitching. So that's the only reason that I'm lifting up the clips on the left hand side as I go. Okay, so this cork is kind of sticky and a little bit stretchy. It's difficult to work with, to be honest. So you can probably tell I've got like a little bit of a kink. So this should all stretch out. Because it's stretchy, by the time I fit the gusset, it'll all be okay. But at the moment, it's quite annoying to sew. So what I'm going to do next is grab the other exterior top piece, and I'm going to place that right sides together with the zip. So make sure that it's lining up here, or if you've marked your centers that it's lining up, and then just clip together and baste that with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that's basted, flip that over and place the remaining lining top gusset piece right side down. So this is going to be right sides together with the other lining piece. Make sure it's lined up on the edges and then clip into place. Now I'm going to sew that again with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that's done, we're going to do the same as we did last time, where we just push it away from the zip on both the lining and the exterior. And then I'm going to clip them together and top stitch this long edge and baste the other 3 edges. Okay, so that is now all sewn together. Now you can see it's kind of stretched a little bit as I've sewn it. Ideally, you would use a walking foot on a fabric like this that's kind of sticky, and then you won't have this problem, but my walking foot is just no good. So what I'm going to do now is check this against the width of the base. So you want to just check that the width here is the same as here. And you can see my base is very slightly bigger, so I'm going to trim that down to match. make sure you trim your lining as well so that they both match. You may want to wait and fit your lining stabilizer until this point, because if you use like a significantly different seam allowance here, so say you used like a full 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, this is going to be smaller. You're going to have to trim more off, and you don't want to end up with your Peltex in your seams. Okay, now that they match, I'm going to place the exterior base gusset right sides together with one end. Now, if you haven't put your zip pull on, do that now. Now I'm just going to clip those right sides together, and I'm going to baste this edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so now we're going to flip this over so that we're looking at the lining side of the top gusset, and place the lining right sides together. So this is the lining base, and just clip everything together. And then we're going to sew through this with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But if you like a tight gusset, I love tight gussets, use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So 3/8 of an inch will give you sort of an easy to fit gusset. Personally, I think that gussets are much easier to fit when they are smaller, because you can actually stretch them around the corners. Also, if you're using a slightly stretchy fabric, so anything that's got a little bit of stretch in it, like more faux leather or denim, I would definitely recommend using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. Okay, so the reason I like to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here is because this makes the gusset smaller. Now, when you're fitting a gusset, you're not fitting it to this circumference here. You're fitting it 3/8 of an inch in. And the circumference 3/8 of an inch in is much smaller. So the gusset needs to be smaller in order to fit around here. Now, a lot of people don't like working with tight gussets because it's harder and you have to snip in and stretch it around, but it means you're a lot less likely to get puckers. And I just think it's a much easier way to fit it. But if you prefer a bigger gusset, use the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you prefer a tight fitting gusset, use 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you are unsure and you don't know, just start with the standard. Just start with the 3/8 and see how you get on. Now what we're going to do is just push that back and get a nice neat finish, and then push it back on the exterior side too. So make sure that you've pressed the seam away, and then just clip the base pieces together. I'm going to top stitch through here with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you use a nice big needle for this. There's a lot of layers going on through here, so I'm going to increase my needle now to a size 100. When you're sewing bags, bear in mind adjusting your tension. So because there's so many thick layers here, I've increased my tension just for this section. And that means I get some nice stitches underneath. If your stitches are kind of loopy underneath here, that means you need to increase your top tension. It's always just worth spending a bit of time like playing around, getting used to the tension settings on your machine, because when you're sewing bags, you go from sewing like, you know, thin little pockets to really thick seams, and it's good to be able to adjust it when you need to. Okay, so grab the other end of your exterior base and place that right sides together with the other end. And then we're just going to baste that in place. Now flip that over and bring the other side of the lining base up to the same edge, and just clip that together so everything is sandwiched together. And again, you can use a standard 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here, or if you want a really tight gusset, use 1/2 inch. If you just want like a slightly tighter gusset, use 3/8 of an inch, because you don't need to match this to the other side. It won't make any difference, and that will shorten your gusset. Each time you do this, it will shorten your gusset by 1/4 of an inch. So because we did it on this end, we've shortened it by 1/4 of an inch. If we do it on this end as well, it will shorten it by 1/2 inch. So if you've got really stretchy fabrics, do it on both sides. If not, and you just want it a little bit shorter, just do it on one side. If you're not sure, just stick to the standard seam allowance all the way through. Okay, so now that's done, what we need to do is turn this right sides out so that the wrong sides of the bases are together. And we need to press the lining and the exterior away like we did on the other side. So we're getting a nice neat edge here for us to top stitch. And I'm going to take this over to the machine and just top stitch this with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so the last step for this section is to baste these edges together so that we can close off this base. So what you need to do is kind of stretch it out. Sometimes it can feel like your lining is a little too big, but generally this is just because the stabilizer is kind of like pushing it up. So you want to get it nice and flat and then clip it in the middle. And then you can clip it the rest of the way. Okay, once that's clipped, I'm just going to baste both of these long edges. Okay, so set your completed gusset aside and we'll move on to step 5. Step 5 is the lining. For this step, you're going to need your 2 exterior panels. You're going to need your slip pocket overlay, your 2 slip pocket pieces, and your 2 main lining panels, which should both have your stabilizer on them. So we'll start just with the slip pocket. Now, if you don't want to do the slip pocket overlay, that is absolutely fine. This is an optional step. It needs to be a raw edge material, such as cork or vinyl or leather. But if you don't want to do that, just follow the steps in the pattern for what to do if you're not having it. Now, this pocket is wider than it is tall, so this is the correct way around. And what we're going to do is we're going to place the 2 pieces right sides together and clip them. And we're going to sew the sides and the bottom, but we're leaving the top open. We're using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that you use an accurate seam allowance on the sides, because otherwise your slip pocket overlay won't fit correctly. Okay, so once your slip pocket is sewn, you can just trim the corners like this. This will ensure that it's a little bit easier to turn out. And then you can just turn this out through that top section that we left unsewn. And if you've got one, you just want to use a turning tool to kind of push those seams open and really poke out the corners. Now what I'm going to do is take it over to the iron and press this as well to get a really nice neat finish on all the edges. Okay, so my pocket's looking a bit neater now and this top edge is still open. So on my slip pocket overlay, I've put some double-sided tape on the edges. Now you could, if you prefer, use fabric glue. It just really depends on the fabrics you're using and what you prefer to work with. But what we want to do is wrap this around the top edge and make sure that it meets. So you can see these 2 edges are meeting there. So once I'm happy with that placement, I'm just going to unfold it. And you can draw a line down the center to try and help you match it up, but depending how thick your fabric is, it's not always going to help you line it up perfectly. So once you're happy that that is even on both sides, just stick that in place. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and I'm going to top stitch from this raw edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and then with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Right, once that's sewn, you can mark your main panel as per the pattern. So I've marked mine up from the bottom and I've also marked the centre Then I've marked the centre on my slip pocket. What I'm going to do is just match up those centre marks and make sure that it's sitting level on that line that I've drawn. And then I'm going to clip it in place. You could use maybe a little bit of fabric glue, but that's up to you. But as I'm only using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm just going to fold this over and clip it in place temporarily. And then as I'm sewing it, I will remove these clips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew, starting here, back stitching well with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance down the edge of the pocket, across the bottom and back up. And as I do this, I'll just remove the clips to get the panel out of the way. Okay, so that is the slip pocket fitted. Now I'm going to grab the exterior back panel. So this is the one with the zip pocket on it. And I'm going to put these two panels wrong sides together. Now you need to match them up and clip them in place. And you might find that because of the pocket, sometimes the exterior panel feels like it's a bit smaller. If you open up the zip, it'll help you fit it better. Now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and baste around the entire outside with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that's basted, you need to do the exact same thing with the exterior front panel and the remaining lining piece. So that's been basted in exactly the same way. Now we just need to fit the strap. So your pattern piece has marks where you can then mark your back panel for placement. And what you want to do is grab your bottom strap piece, and then you want to make sure that it's between the two lines at the angle indicated. So on this edge it's going to match up, and on this edge it's going to have a big overhang. And I'm just going to clip that in place. Now this is quite a lot of layers, so you are definitely going to want a bigger needle at this point. So we're just going to baste this in place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that's basted in place, we can move on to the final step. Step 6 is the final construction. For this step, you're going to need both your panels. You're going to need your gusset, your short cotton webbing, and your 2 pieces of binding. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the centres top and bottom on both of these panels. Then I'm going to mark the centres on the top gusset and the base gusset. To do that, you just bring these seams together, and then you can easily mark the centre. Once all your centres are marked, you might find it helpful just to roll this strap up a bit because it's kind of going to be in the way. Okay, so we're going to start with the front panel. And what we want is for the zip to be closing to the left. So make sure it's closing to the left. And then match up the top centre mark on your gusset to the top centre mark on your panel and clip together. Do the same on the bottom edge. So just match up those centre marks too. Okay, so we need to make this gusset fit, and it's not going to just fit straight up, especially if you've used the larger seam allowance. You need to snip into the corners so that the gusset can spread around the corners. So where it's going to be on a corner, all you want to do is snip in about 1/4 of an inch Definitely no more than that. And then on these top corners, we want to do the same thing, but a little bit further apart. Okay, so I'm going to clip the rest into place around the top. And as I do it, because I've done those little snips, I can kind of stretch the gusset around it. Okay, so your corners will end up like this, and it looks like the gusset isn't going to fit. This is why we've snipped into it, because it has to stretch around. Because we're not sewing on the edge, we're sewing further in, so we need it to stretch around. So if you haven't stretched it enough at the top, then you will struggle to get it in, and you might need to just readjust your clips at the top, or do a few extra snips. Now, if you use the smaller seam allowance, you might even get away with no snips at all, but it is important to snip and make sure that the gusset spreads out like this, so you can see how it's spreading where the snips are. So I'll just clip the rest of that into place. Once that's all clipped into place, you can take that straight over to the sewing machine if you want and sew it. Personally, I prefer to baste it in place first with a bit of hand stitching. So a lot of people like to use staples instead, but if you use staples, just bear in mind that you have to avoid them when you're stitching and you have to remove them afterwards. Whereas with a bit of hand stitching, you can just kind of leave it in. You can be as messy as you like. This doesn't need to be neat. You know, this is literally just going to be holding it in place temporarily. So my stitches are pretty massive. I'm not going to take my time and be careful about this. This is just, it's acting like the clips, but it's going to be a lot more secure, and it's going to stop any movement when I go to the sewing machine. So if you take this straight over to the sewing machine and sew it now, you will find it's a lot more stressful to sew because stuff will kind of shift, especially on the tight corners. It will shift as you're sewing it. If you baste it in first, then when you take it to the sewing machine, nothing's going to move. It's going to be a lot quicker once you're actually sewing it. Now that's hand basted, I'm going to take it over to the machine and sew this panel on. So I like to sew it on the machine like this, so that I can come around the corners like this, and I find that that gets me a really neat curve. However, Adam prefers to sew it like this on top. I feel like then the stabilizer is kind of pushing my presser foot out, so I don't enjoy sewing that way around. But you can give it a try. If not tried both ways, just give it a try and see which you prefer. We're going to use a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on this. That's because later on we'll sew the binding on with a full 3/8 of an inch. And ideally, we don't want to be going over the same stitches twice when you're using cork and vinyl. So by using a 3/8 of an inch now, we're making sure that our stitching is separate. I like to use an awl on the corners. It helps me get around the curves and just make sure that I can hold everything in place, and you can get really close to the presser foot with it, much closer than you can with your hands. So an awl is a great tool for this, or a lot of people use a stiletto, which does the same thing. Okay, so you could do a quick check just to see that you haven't got any puckers or anything like that going on. If you have, you can always unstitch and redo, but my corners all look nice and neat, so I'm quite happy with that. Now I need to fit the binding. So grab one of your pieces of binding, and I like to start at the top because when you open up the bag and look in, you can't really see what's up here, so the join will be hidden. So I'm just going to wrap it around my seam. Now what I like to do, a lot of people sew binding on one side and then turn it over and sew it again. I don't like to get that many lines of stitching going through my cork or my vinyl. It never seems like a good idea because you can kind of perforate the fabric. Also, I just find I get a better finish when I do it this way, and I much prefer it. So this may be considered cheating, but this is my way of doing binding. I wrap it around the whole seam and then I clip it. Now I'm going to sew from this side, so I'll be looking at that side when I'm sewing it, which means when I'm fitting my binding I want to look at this side and make sure that it's covering all of my stitches, because this is the side I'm not going to see later on. So you're just going to wrap your binding around the seam, around the whole length until you get back to the beginning. Once you get back to the beginning, you'll have a bit of overlap. So I'm just going to chop mine down so it's not quite so long. And then you need to fold this edge over and overlap it over your raw edge. Now we're going to take this over to the machine and sew this on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I would definitely recommend using a thread colour that matches your binding. It will just look so much neater inside the bag if you do that. So I'm going to take that over to the machine and sew it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn that on, just check that you've caught the binding all the way around. So I can see there's a tiny bit just there, so I'm just going to go back and just sew over that. This will definitely be a problem if, like me, you're using 1/2 inch binding that isn't actually 1/2 inch wide. So this binding is really hard to work with because it's not actually wide enough. So when you get your 1/2 inch binding, make sure it's actually 1/2 inch. Now grab your back panel and we're going to attach the strap tab. So make sure that your strap is completely straight and you want it to be lying flat like this. So I've marked the center by cutting it out, and I'm just going to match that to the center mark on the main panel and clip them together. Then I'm going to clip it around the rest of this top curve. So you're going to have to make it work for you to go around that curve. And now we just want to baste that in place. Okay, so before you go any further, just double check that your strap is not twisted and that it's all straight. Once you're confident about that, grab your grab handle. Now, a lot of my testers like to make theirs longer, so feel free to do that. This is just the length that I like to have my grab handle. I like it to be kind of grabby, not too big. So we're going to clip it next to the strap tab, and then we're going to bring it around and clip it on the other side. Just make sure again that it's not twisted. You want it so that it's angled, like in line with the strap tab, but you don't want it to overlap the strap tab because then you'll end up with too much bulk in your seam. So we'll just baste that in place. Okay, so if you want to, you can trim this down now where the overhang is, or you can leave it till later. It's totally up to you. I'll do mine now. So you just want it to match the rest of the panel. Okay, now we're going to do exactly what we did with the front panel to attach the back. So first of all, I'm just going to make my strap shorter to try and save space in here. I kind of want it to be able to fold up like that. Now what we want to do is match the center gusset marks to the center marks on this main panel. Just like we did with the front panel, we're going to match the top and bottom first, then we're going to snip into the corners of the gusset and stretch it around. Now that's all clipped in place, I'm going to hand baste it again before I sew it on the machine. This back panel is harder to sew than the front. It's just because the body of the bag has to fit under your machine, so it is going to be more difficult. So if you kind of struggled with the first panel, then definitely give this one a go at hand basting. It only takes about 5 minutes and it saves you more than that once you get to the machine. You might find it easier to open your zip. Everybody has different preferences, but you might find it easier to sew on with the zip open. So I'm going to hand baste this, then I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and sew it with a scant 3/8 of an inch. So I would say that this is the most difficult bit, which is why I love to hand baste it on first. Don't be afraid to just like move it around and really, you know, like crush the bag, make it fit through where you need it to fit through. You know, you're not going to hurt it. Bags, they're designed to survive a lot, so don't worry about, you know, having to squash it a little bit as it goes through just to make it fit. Make sure that everything's staying in place as you sew it, and just take your time. And if you need to go around a second time, don't worry about it, just go around a second time. You know, if you've missed the seam allowance and you've only done a 1/4 inch the first time, go around with a scant 3/8. It won't be a problem because we're only doing 1 layer of stitching on the binding. Okay, so once it's done, if you have any little bits like this up where the strap tab is, you can just trim those off, because otherwise your binding isn't really going to fit. And if you haven't already, you can trim down where your strap tab is. Okay, and now we're going to grab the binding and we're going to do exactly the same as we did on the front panel. Wrap it around. So again, because I'm sewing from this direction and I'll be looking at it from here, I'm going to clip it into place from this direction so that I can check that it covers the seam and the stitching on this side, because this is the side that will be hidden from my view once I'm sewing. So I'm going to wrap this all the way around until I get back to the beginning. Okay, so I've fitted the binding again. Again, I've joined it at the top. In the pattern, I joined it at the bottom. Either way is great, because like you're not going to see the top, but you're also not going to see the bottom, because once you've got something in the bag, you can't see it. So you take your pick where you want to start and finish the binding. So I'm going to sew that on again with a matching black thread. Matching thread, it just looks so neat because you can't see if you do have to sew over it again. So I will do that, and then we can turn the bag right side out. Okay, so that's it. Your bag is done and it's ready to turn out. Now, don't be too disheartened if you turn it out and there is something that you need to redo. You know, it doesn't always go perfect first time, but hopefully it will. Okay, so before I go to the effort of pushing the bottom out, I'm just going to check the tops. And that's looking really good. You just want to make sure that you've caught everything and that you haven't got like basting stitches showing or something. You know, if you've used an incorrect seam allowance at some point. Okay, so as you push from the inside, you can push your curves out. Sort of push it on the binding, and you can do a little bit of this and all sorts to get like the seam to come out nice. Ooh, the front's turned out really well. Oh, I'm pretty happy with the back as well, so that is looking pretty cool. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. I have to admit, once I cut it out, I started panicking about how much colour was in this bag, but it looks so cool. So I'm really happy with that. And that interfacing that I was trying out just is really nice. I mean, I've used a few different interfacings, and oh, my corner's not popped out, is it? I've used a few different interfacings that I've trialed, and then kind of like they've wrinkled after I've turned a bag out, and no matter what I do I can't get it nice. But look at that, I didn't even iron that, I haven't even pressed it, I just turned it out and it's great. I am very happy with this bag. So yeah, let me know what you think. Hoping that you guys enjoyed this tutorial and that you like this bag as much as I do. So thanks so much for joining us, and hope to see you soon. Bye.